In 1930, during French colonial rule, nationalists formed the Vietnamese Communist Party or VCP with the aim of ending French colonialism and gaining Vietnam's independence. The VCP soon reorganized into the Indochinese Communist Party or ICP to include membership to Cambodian and Laotian communists. Then in 1951, the ICP split into three nationalist organizations for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. During World War II in Vietnam, the Viet Minh, a Vietnamese militia, fought a guerrilla war against the occupying Japanese forces. After World War II, the Viet Minh then fought an independence war against the returning French colonial forces. The war led to the 1954 Geneva Accords, which ended French colonial rule and granted the independences of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Cambodia became a constitutional monarchy under King Norodom Sihanouk. Vietnam was partitioned into two military zones, which became Socialist North Vietnam and West-aligned South Vietnam. Fighting soon broke out again in the Second Indochina War, which was a proxy war in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In April 1975, North Vietnam defeated South Vietnam, and in July 1976, Vietnam was reunified as one country under socialist rule. Also in April 1975, Cambodian communists known as the Khmer Rouge and led by Pol Pot overthrew the US-backed Lon Nol regime, ending the Cambodian Civil War. Laotian communists also emerged victorious in December 1975 in the Laotian Civil War. In Cambodia, soon after coming to power, the Khmer Rouge launched one of history's most astounding social revolutions, forcibly emptying towns and cities and sending the entire population to the countryside to become peasant workers in agrarian communes under a feudal-type forced labor system. All lands and properties were nationalized, and banks, schools, hospitals, and industries were shut down. Money was abolished. Government officials and military officers of the previous regime, teachers, doctors, academics, businessmen, professionals, and all persons with education or who had associated with the West were jailed, tortured, and executed. The socialist experiment ended in disaster, with some 1.5 to 2.5 million Cambodians, or 25% of the population, perishing in the Cambodian genocide. In the aftermath of the Second Indochina War, the international community believed that Cambodia and Vietnam would establish close relations due to their shared Marxist ties. However, the apparent communist solidarity between Vietnam and Cambodia was only superficial, because even before they had won their revolutions, in 1973 to 1974, armed clashes took place between the Khmer Rouge and North Vietnamese units inside Cambodia. Then in May 1975, just 1 month after Cambodia and Vietnam had won their revolutions, small-scale fighting began breaking out along their common border. Also that month, Khmer forces seized Vietnam's Phu Quoc and To Chu Islands. Vietnamese forces recaptured these islands and retaliated by invading Co Vai. The Vietnamese withdrew from Co Vai in August 1975 following a state visit by Pol Pot to Hanoi 2 months earlier. 1976 saw a period of improved Cambodia-Vietnam relations. Border fighting eased, Cambodia called for Vietnam's membership to the UN, Vietnam downplayed reports of widespread human rights violations in Cambodia, and commercial flights between Hanoi and Phnom Penh opened in September 1976. In May 1976, Cambodian and Vietnamese negotiators met to try and resolve their disputed maritime border along the Breville Line, a French colonial-era demarcation, but talks broke down. Furthermore, many Cambodians resented the loss of the historic Cambodian lands that now form the southernmost territory of Vietnam, although the Khmer Rouge apparently did not officially claim this territory to be part of Cambodia. 1977 saw a resurgence of fighting. In April 1977, Khmer forces attacked Chau Doc, and in September, thousands of Khmer troops made incursions into Tay Ninh province. In October 1977, 8 Vietnamese divisions threw back the attackers. Then in January 1978, Vietnamese forces entered Cambodia's Svay Rieng province but later withdrew back into Vietnam. In 1977, Pol Pot visited Beijing, solidifying Cambodia-China relations. China soon began sending large quantities of weapons and military hardware to Cambodia. the Cambodia-Vietnam crisis took on the dimension of a proxy conflict between China and the Soviet Union, as the Chinese supported the Khmer Rouge while the Soviets backed Vietnam. In May 1978, Pol Pot began a purge of the Eastern Military Zone, forcing thousands of Khmer Rouge cadres there to flee into Vietnam. In December 1978, under Vietnamese sponsorship, these ex-Eastern Military Zone cadres organized as a political military movement whose aim was to overthrow the Khmer Rouge regime. In June 1978, Vietnam prepared for a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. By November 1978, Vietnamese forces were massed along the southwestern border. Vietnam also took the precaution of securing its northern border against a possible Chinese attack by signing a military agreement with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, China increased its weapons deliveries to Cambodia, which had reinforced its eastern border with 14 divisions. On December 25, 1978, following a diversionary attack on Kratie, 120,000 Vietnamese troops, backed by air, artillery, and armored units, and supported by 20,000 Cambodian rebel fighters, invaded Takeo province, bypassing Svay Rieng, where Khmer forces were massed. After capturing Takeo, Vietnamese tanks sped down the flat countryside and reached Phnom Penh on January 7, 1979. The Khmer Rouge was overthrown, and on January 10, 1979, Vietnam turned over Cambodia's administration to the Cambodian rebels, which took over political power as the People's Republic of Kampuchea, or PRK. In February 1979, the PRK and Vietnam signed a treaty which formalized the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. The PRK also abolished the agrarian communes set up by the Khmer Rouge and allowed Cambodians to return to their homes. The mass killings perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge during the Cambodian genocide thus came to an end. In retaliation for Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, in February 1979, China launched an offensive into northern Vietnam before withdrawing the following month. Meanwhile, Pol Pot and the bulk of the Khmer Rouge army withdrew to the jungle mountains of western Cambodia near the Thai border, where they reorganized as a guerrilla militia aimed at overthrowing the PRK and expelling the Vietnamese army. At this stage, two rival governments claimed to be the legitimate authority of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge and the PRK. Thereafter, the war was fought on the battlefield as much as on the diplomatic front. At the United Nations, or UN, China, the United States, and ASEAN pressed to have the Khmer Rouge retain its seat in the UN, while the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and Vietnam lobbied that Cambodia's UN membership be transferred to the PRK. In September 1979, the UN declared that the Khmer Rouge would continue to represent Cambodia in the UN. The Khmer Rouge resistance to the PRK and the Vietnamese occupation was soon joined by two other guerrilla militias. China provided military support to the Khmer Rouge, while the United States backed the two other militias. Even then, the three resistance groups failed to seriously challenge the 200,000-strong Vietnamese occupation forces or the Vietnamese-backed PRK government during the war. In June 1982, the three Cambodian resistance groups signed an agreement and formed the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea, or CGDK, with Prince Sihanouk as president. The UN transferred Cambodia's seat to CGDK, which gained recognition in the West as the legitimate government of Cambodia. By contrast, the Vietnamese-sponsored PRK government, like Vietnam itself, continued to face regional and international isolation. The PRK government was deprived of much-needed Western financial assistance, which was badly needed to rehabilitate Cambodia's war-ravaged economy. The PRK's military suffered from shortage of weapons, inadequate funding, and poor morale. Consequently, the Vietnamese army did most of the fighting during the war. From 1980 to 1987, the Vietnamese launched annual dry season offensives along the Thai border. Vietnamese forces also sometimes entered Thailand to pursue the guerrillas, leading to armed clashes with Thai forces. Artillery, rocket, and mortar duels between Thai and Vietnamese forces occurred frequently, which caused heavy casualties on Thai civilians and Cambodian refugees caught in the crossfire. The Vietnamese offensives were fiercest in 1984 to 1985, when they destroyed most of the rebel camps and forced the guerrillas to flee into Thailand. The Vietnamese army also reinforced the 800-kilometer-long Thai-Cambodian border with trenches, barbed wire fences, and minefields to stop the rebel attacks from Thailand into Cambodia and to prevent the escape of Cambodians into Thailand. In retaliation for these offensives, in April to July 1984, China attacked Vietnam's Lang Son and Hatuyan provinces, advancing 2 to 3 kilometers deep using armored units before withdrawing across the border. The Cambodia-Vietnam conflict eventually degraded into a costly war of attrition with no end in sight. But by the late 1980s, the Cold War was drawing to a close, with socialist countries in Eastern Europe shedding Marxist ideology and adopting Western democracy. And at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and ended economic support to its socialist clients around the world. Vietnam and Cambodia were severely affected by the loss of Soviet aid, and in 1986, Vietnam began to withdraw its forces from Cambodia, which was completed in 1989. The Cambodian government toned down its hardline position and began peace talks with the three resistance groups, which led in October 1991 to a peace treaty, which ended the 12-year war. In November 1991, UN peacekeepers arrived in Cambodia to enforce the peace treaty. Following the ratification of a new constitution in September 1993, Cambodia became a constitutional monarchy called the Kingdom of Cambodia, with Sihanouk restored as king and head of state and the prime minister as head of government. Then, with the death of Pol Pot in April 1998, the Khmer Rouge ceased to exist. After 3 decades of war, Cambodia was at peace.